Hi, Skye. Thanks so much for being here with us today. Can you explain a little bit about your role at Environment Montana?
Sure. I am the State Director of Environment Montana, which is one of the state offices of the Environment America Network.
Awesome. And what are the goals of the organization?
We're your typical big tent green environmental group. We work on clean air, clean water, and open space. We have two different entities. I have a C3 nonprofit called Environment Montana Research and Policy Center, and a C4 lobbying entity called Environment Montana. And those two work in concert with each other to promote good environmental policies.
Awesome. So we're going to go through some of the questions of the volunteer leader needs assessment worksheet, and I'm just going to kind of cater some of those for this interview. But in the work that you do, are you able to meet the goals of the program with your staff capacity, or do you have to include volunteers to make your goals attainable?
Nothing we do can be done with staff alone.
Okay.
The overall goals of our organization, no matter what campaign we're running, are to change hearts and minds for our issues and to ensure that we have good policies that reflect those values. If it's just me shouting into the void, I'll never affect change and do what we need to do. So volunteers are a critical part of all of the work that we do.
And what kind of volunteer projects do you oversee, or how do you utilize volunteers for some of that work?
Yeah, so, the biggest way by far that we use volunteers is we use volunteers as storytellers to tell the stories that we are not able to tell ourselves. And that takes a number of different forms. We recruit volunteers to do media events with us. For example, we produced a report about a sugar beet processing facility in Billings that had exceeded its wastewater permit over 100 times, really creating a dangerous condition in the waterways there. But I felt like an environmentalist from Missoula coming in and telling Billings they're doing it wrong would not get the message across that we wanted to. So for that event, we invited media, and I had a Billings mom who was there, who walks her dogs there, her kids swim there. She was able to speak from her heart about how that impacted her and her family's lives. That is an example of storytelling that we try to effectively use in everything that we do.
Yeah, that's great.
The other thing that we use volunteers for is just to do more of what I do in citizen outreach and in research. So I am a one-person staff here in Missoula. And so there's a lot of places where I just simply can't be. So for example, this summer I used volunteers to help a big microplastics sampling project that we had. We sampled 50 river access sites for microplastics. I absolutely love hanging out on Montana waterways, but getting to all 50 all across the state was a bit of a lift.
Yeah.
So we had a number of volunteers that would go out and take samples for us.
Yeah, that's cool. So, and that was one of the questions, is these specific needs that you have volunteers fill, and it sounds like a huge range from partaking in media, but then also doing kind of a citizen science type work as well.
Yeah, we do a big range. The overall goal for everything that we do with volunteer outreach is to be cultivating future leaders. We want people to feel bought into our campaigns, personally invested in them, and motivated to take a next step, whatever that next step is. So that's the common thread with all of our volunteer activities, is that no matter what it is, if the person doesn't come back to me and say, so what's next, what else can I do, then it's been a little bit of a failure.
Yeah. And that kind of goes well for the next question. I think sometimes organizations that are trying to use volunteers don't always use them in a genuine way, and I've been guilty of that in my own organization where I want to plug someone in, but the need is kind of contrived. So, you know, is your need of volunteers genuine or contrived, or is it a mix of both?
You know, I think one of the mistakes that I've made in the past is not being able to see the forest from the trees. I think so often when you're in the middle of a project, you see project needs, and you're like, I want to just like check off the boxes so that I can get this report out or get this, you know, whatever done. And I think that tends to be a bad use of volunteers from what I've found. I think when we're really looking to create authentic experiences for the people that are helping out with our work, it ends up being much more effective in terms of actually getting things done.
Right.
Because if you're having fun and you want to do it, you'll do it well.
Right.
If you're there to check off a box, you kind of know it pretty quickly. So, you know, one of the things that I constantly try to do, and I don't know whether this falls into the contrived or not contrived category, but is to really design all of the volunteer work that we have so that it's engaging, interesting, and gives the participants an opportunity to really think through how they think about a given issue. I feel like one of the most successful volunteer efforts that I did last year was I partnered with a bunch of other environmental groups to bus climate leaders down to Gillette, Wyoming to speak at the Clean Power Plan hearings. And we found a lot of really great groups with a lot of different perspectives. We had concerned parents, we had wildland firefighters, we had wildlife experts, we had Forest Service employees, we had a wide range, government folks who were doing climate mitigation strategies in their communities. And it was great to have them speak. It was helpful. It helped to make our case in the national stage. The actual purpose of the volunteer work, they were helping. But the reason why it was so successful is that we had 25 incredibly talented people who were passionate about an issue stuck in a bus for 8 hours. And every single person got off of that bus with a follow-up plan for future action, new collaborations, and that's the dream for me, right? Is that they have come up with all these different things that they're planning to do that I'm not involved in. I don't have to organize. You know, I organized the bus to Gillette, but all the 20 or 30 spin-off projects that came from that trip were just organic and happened on their own. And the more I can create experiences like that, the easier my work gets.
Right. And that's a great, I mean, the next question that you kind of answered is, you know, does the volunteer leader have ownership of projects? And that was something, too, that came up in people's discussion answers from the last week of how can you motivate volunteers. And several people said, you know, giving them autonomy and really letting people have some sort of ownership of the work that they're doing. And it sounds like that's something that you do. I mean, you have to do in order to be effective.
Yeah, I mean, certainly when we're getting together for the task at hand, I do exercise a little bit of ownership. Particularly in my line of work, a lot of times the volunteers that I'm bringing in are coming to talk to senators or speak to the city council. And I have to continue to have those relationships after whatever short-term campaign we have is going on. So I do a lot of work on the front end with sort of expectation setting and making sure that people are comfortable with the approach that we take. You know, I do a lot of conversations where I sit down and I say, look, we feel passionately about this issue. We're not going to go into Senator Dane's office and yell at the staffer. She's actually quite nice, and I have to continue to work with her. She disagrees with us, but we're not going to be mean. And if you're not okay with that, you cannot come.
You know? Yeah.
And I have to do that in a number of different situations where I do set the tone for the specific event. But for sure, if based on the relationships they've made during my volunteer meeting, if they want to go do something a little bit more radical that's not quite so on brand with Environment Montana, that's fine.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's that mix of giving someone ownership and like letting them know that their voice matters, and that their work matters, but also providing support and some structure and what's appropriate for your organization.
Right. And saying, this is our philosophy. This is how we do things. And there have been, some situations where, they said, I'm just not comfortable with that. Particularly, we tend to be pretty moderate. We work within the system. We're institutionalists. We pass legislations with the legislature we have.
Yeah.
And, I am always happy to send people to other volunteer opportunities if they think it's not a good fit for them.
Yeah.
So they continue to be a part of that environmental ecosystem, but there's always other opportunities for people that would be a better fit for them.
Right.
And I think it is good to be honest up front with about what you need.
And so that's part of being someone who manages volunteers, is really saying, where can I fit this person in, and is this person a good fit based on their interests and passions, and knowing when to say it might not be the best fit for your organization.
Right. But here's another group that you could reach out to. Let me send you an intro email.
And how do you weigh, so it's a lot of work, training and supporting volunteers. So kind of what's that cost-benefit analysis, or how do you weigh the work of training and supporting volunteers?
I definitely have found over the years that some jobs are much better suited for volunteers than others. I think the biggest issue with that is just making sure whatever task you have is doesn't have a steep learning curve.
Yeah.
They can pick it up right away, because you don't have a guarantee that your volunteer is going to come back the next day. They're here on their own free time.
Yeah.
So something that people can pick up very quickly and really feel comfortable in the task as quickly as possible, I think has a greater rate of success. That the microplastic sampling was a good example of that. All they really needed to do was find the fishing access site and dip the bottle in the water. Maybe take a couple social media posts. That was really it. So it was something that people could pick up pretty quickly, feel comfortable that they're contributing in a good, helpful way.
Right.
And just kind of feel comfortable in the process right away.
Yeah. That's great.
The other thing that I feel like is incredibly important is for people to feel as though their strengths are being adequately used. So if someone comes to me and clearly displays a passion for arts or writing or advocacy work, I find a role for that talent, because we all want to feel as though we're using our strengths to the best of our ability. And when you feel as though your talents have been harnessed, you're more likely to want to come back and re-engage later on. So that's been a real critical thing for me too, is in the very beginning when anybody approaches me about wanting to help, I say, what are you good at? What do you want to do? And then we figure out how to make it fit in with our broader scheme of things.
Yeah.
The last thing is fun.
Yeah.
It helps. It helps for things to be fun. One of the good volunteer activities we've designed in the past is Missoula Loves to March.
Yeah.
There's quite a few marches, and it looks kind of contrived if you just have a bunch of printed posters that are the exact same. It looks like some group like mine parachuted in with a bunch of printed posters and handed them out. So I always get volunteers to come into the office the night before and make handmade posters.
Yeah.
And I have food, and I have beer.
Yeah.
And a bunch of markers, and we get to draw.
Yeah.
we're in elementary school again,
Right.
and it's lovely.
Yeah.
And again, that's facilitating good conversations between people that are more likely to spin off into other projects.
Right. I think as someone who's managed volunteers, there's been times where I've made things easier and realized that they want to be there to work, and maybe spending that extra time making the poster, they're also forming relationships. So
Right.
making a task the easiest isn't necessarily good volunteer management.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's important to put some time on the front end in thinking about what's getting people to walk through the door.
Yeah.
And I think for a lot of us, we volunteer because we care about an issue,
Right.
but we also volunteer because we want to meet new people that have similar interests. We want to feel like we're part of a bigger group.
Yeah.
So, a volunteer project where you're just like immediately putting someone in like a position in the corner where they're like stuffing envelopes or something like that doesn't necessarily like meet all of the expectations that they have that brought them there. Or maybe it does.
Yeah.
Maybe they don't want to talk to anyone.
Right.
And it's important to kind of suss that out.
Right. Yeah, that's a really good point. My last question is just there are people in the class who really want to get into the environmental sector, and there's a lot of interest. And there are people in the class who are, managing volunteers or want to manage volunteers. So do you have any advice for people who want to get into the environmental sector or, who are managing volunteers?
Do it.
Yeah.
We need all the help we can get all the time.
Yeah.
I mean, the other advice that I would have is to just volunteer yourself. You learn a lot about how to manage volunteers by being a volunteer and having that experience and really thinking critically about how the different projects you do make you feel and how likely they are to make you want to come back or to advocate for that issue. And I think just getting the experience of seeing how a lot of different people do it can be incredibly helpful for helping you to decide how you're going to do it as an environmental leader.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you. It was nice talking.
Great.